What if I told you that a group of farmers, blacksmiths, printers, and shopkeepers once stood up against the most powerful empire on earth and won? This isn't fiction. This is the story of how the United States of America was born through rebellion, sacrifice, impossible odds, and a belief so radical that it reshaped the world forever. In the mid-1700s, America was not a country. It was 13 British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. Life was harsh, but hopeful. Families built homes from raw timber, cleared forests by hand, and carved towns out of wilderness. They considered themselves British subjects. They drank British tea, read British books, and pledged loyalty to the British crown. But everything began to change after the French and Indian War ended in 1763. Britain had won, but victory came at a cost. The empire was drowning in debt, and the solution, from London's perspective, was simple: tax the colonies. To British officials, it was reasonable. The colonies benefited from British protection, so they should help pay for it. But to colonists, it felt different. They had no representatives in Parliament, no vote, no voice. Taxation without representation became more than a complaint. It became a spark. When the Stamp Act forced colonists to pay taxes on newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards, protests erupted. Crowds gathered in the streets of Boston, merchants organized boycotts, pamphlets circulated like wildfire. The tension grew with every new tax. Then came tea. In 1773, the British government granted the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America. Colonists saw it as yet another attempt to control them. On a cold December night, a group of men disguised themselves as Native Americans and boarded ships in Boston Harbor. They dumped 342 chests of tea into the freezing water. The Boston Tea Party was not just an act of protest, it was a declaration of defiance. Britain responded harshly, closing Boston Harbor and imposing what colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, it united the colonies. Representatives gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They didn't yet seek independence, only fairness. But events were moving too fast. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord to seize colonial weapons. Militiamen stood in their path. No one knows who fired the first shot, but when smoke cleared, the American Revolution had begun. Farmers became soldiers overnight. Shopkeepers picked up muskets. They were poorly trained, badly equipped, and facing the most disciplined army in the world. Leading them was George Washington. Washington was not a perfect general. He made mistakes. He lost battles. But he possessed something rarer than brilliance: endurance. He understood that the war was not about winning every fight. It was about surviving long enough to make Britain give up. The winter at Valley Forge in 1777 tested that endurance like nothing else. Soldiers lacked boots. Many wrapped their feet in rags. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. Some men deserted. Others stayed. Washington rode among them daily, sharing their hardships. Slowly, discipline improved under Baron von Steuben's training. What emerged from that winter was not a ragged militia. It was an army. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson drafted a document that would echo across centuries: the Declaration of Independence. Adopted on July 4th, 1776, it did more than announce separation from Britain. It proclaimed that all men are created equal and possess unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those words were revolutionary. They challenged monarchy itself. The war dragged on for years. Cities fell, armies retreated, families were divided between loyalists and patriots. But then came a turning point. At Yorktown in 1781, American forces, supported by French troops and naval power, trapped British General Cornwallis. Surrounded and outnumbered, he surrendered. The impossible had happened. A collection of colonies had defeated the British Empire. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized the United States as an independent nation. But winning independence was only the beginning. The new nation faced chaos. The Articles of Confederation proved too weak. The federal government couldn't raise taxes effectively. States argued constantly. The fragile union seemed close to collapse. So in 1787, delegates met again in Philadelphia. Behind closed doors, they debated fiercely. The result was the U.S. Constitution, a bold experiment in self-government. It created checks and balances, dividing power among executive, legislative, and judicial branches. It wasn't perfect. Slavery remained, women had no vote, Native Americans were excluded. The promise of equality was incomplete, but the framework allowed change, and change came, often through struggle. By the mid-1800s, the nation was expanding westward. Railroads stretched across plains, gold was discovered in California, immigrants arrived by the millions, chasing opportunity. But the question of slavery haunted the country. Northern states industrialized and increasingly opposed slavery's expansion. Southern states depended on enslaved labor for their agricultural economy. Political compromises delayed conflict, but they could not prevent it. In 1861, after Abraham Lincoln was elected president, several Southern states seceded from the Union. The Civil War began. It was the bloodiest conflict in American history. Brother fought brother. Entire towns were devastated. Over 600,000 soldiers died. Lincoln believed the nation could not survive half slave and half free. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states free. It transformed the war from a battle for union into a fight for human freedom. In 1865, the Union prevailed. Slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment, but Lincoln did not live to see the long struggle of Reconstruction. He was assassinated just days after the war ended. The promise of equality faced fierce resistance. Segregation laws emerged. African Americans were denied basic rights for nearly a century. Yet the Constitution's framework endured. By the early 20th century, America had transformed into an industrial powerhouse. Skyscrapers rose in cities. Assembly lines revolutionized production. Immigrants shaped culture, language, and industry. Then came global conflict. During World War I, the United States entered late but decisively, helping tip the balance. Afterward, the country experienced economic boom, the Roaring Twenties, followed by devastating collapse in 1929. The Great Depression left millions unemployed. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Banks failed. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal sought relief, recovery, and reform. Government expanded its role in daily life. Confidence slowly returned. But a far greater storm was brewing overseas. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Overnight, the United States entered World War II. Factories converted to war production. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers. Soldiers fought across Europe and the Pacific. On D-Day, American troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, facing relentless fire. By 1945, Allied victory was within reach. In August, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender. The war ended, but the world had changed forever. The United States emerged as a global superpower. The Cold War followed, a tense standoff with the Soviet Union. Nuclear fear hung in the air. Children practiced duck and cover drills in schools. The space race captivated the world. In 1969, millions watched as American astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, declaring one giant leap for mankind. It symbolized technological dominance and human possibility. Meanwhile, at home, another revolution unfolded. The civil rights movement challenged segregation and racial injustice. Peaceful protests met violent resistance. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. called for nonviolent change. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 marked historic progress. The promise written in 1776 moved closer to reality. The decades that followed brought triumphs and trials: Vietnam, Watergate, economic shifts, technological revolutions, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the rise of the digital age. Then came September 11, 2001. Terrorist attacks on New York and Washington shook the nation. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost. The country united in grief and resolve. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq followed, reshaping global politics once again. Through every era, revolution, civil war, depression, world wars, social upheaval, one theme remains constant: reinvention. The United States has never been static. It has argued with itself, corrected itself, expanded rights, stumbled, and risen again. From 13 colonies hugging the Atlantic coast to a nation spanning a continent, from candlelit pamphlets to satellites orbiting Earth, from wooden ships to spacecraft touching Mars, the journey has been extraordinary. But perhaps the most astonishing part of the story is this: the American experiment was never guaranteed to succeed. It survived because ordinary people believed in extraordinary ideals, because soldiers endured freezing winters, because activists marched across bridges, because immigrants arrived with nothing but hope, because voters demanded change, because citizens debated fiercely yet remained bound by a shared framework. History is not a straight line. It is a struggle between ideals and reality, and the United States, imperfect, powerful, divided, resilient, remains an unfinished story. The question is no longer how it began.
And the next chapter did not begin quietly. It began in fire, fear, ambition, and a new kind of power the world had never seen before. After World War II, the United States stood at the center of global influence. Europe was shattered, empires were collapsing, but America's factories were intact, its military unmatched, and its economy booming. Suburbs spread across the landscape. Highways stitched the country together. The GI Bill sent millions of veterans to college, building the modern middle class. But victory carried a shadow. The Soviet Union had also emerged powerful and armed with nuclear weapons. What followed was not open war, but something more psychologically exhausting: the Cold War. It was a conflict of ideologies: democracy versus communism, capitalism versus state control. Each side believed its system would shape humanity's future. The fear was constant. In the 1950s, American families built fallout shelters in their backyards. School children practiced drills in case of nuclear attack. Politicians warned of communist infiltration. Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed enemies were hiding within the government itself, fueling suspicion and paranoia. Yet at the same time, American culture exploded with optimism. Television entered living rooms, rock and roll emerged, highways connected cities like never before. Corporations grew into global giants. The American dream seemed attainable: a house, a car, steady work, opportunity for your children. Then came space. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. Americans were stunned. Had they fallen behind? The response was immediate. The U.S. invested massively in science and education. NASA was formed. The space race became symbolic of technological supremacy. On July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon during the Apollo 11 mission, millions of Americans felt something powerful: validation, proof that their system could achieve the impossible. But while astronauts walked on the moon, citizens marched in the streets back home. The civil rights movement reached its most intense years in the 1960s. African Americans in the South faced brutal enforcement of segregation. Peaceful protesters were attacked with fire hoses and police dogs. Television broadcast these images nationwide. In 1963, hundreds of thousands gathered in Washington, D.C., where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech, calling America to live up to its founding promise. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected access to the ballot. Laws changed, but hearts and systems would take much longer. Meanwhile, another war was escalating overseas: Vietnam. Initially framed as part of the global struggle against communism, U.S. involvement grew year after year. What began with advisors became full-scale military engagement. American soldiers fought in jungles thousands of miles from home. The war divided the nation. Protest movements grew on college campuses. Television brought battlefield images into living rooms every night. Trust in government began to erode. When Saigon fell in 1975, the war ended not in victory, but in exhaustion. The 1970s continued testing American confidence. The Watergate scandal forced President Richard Nixon to resign, the only U.S. president to do so. The event reinforced a critical truth: no one, not even the president, stood above the law. The constitutional system held. Economic troubles followed. Oil crises led to long gas lines. Inflation soared. Americans questioned whether their nation was in decline. Then, slowly, momentum shifted again. The 1980s brought economic restructuring, military buildup, and renewed confrontation with the Soviet Union. President Ronald Reagan described the USSR as an evil empire. Yet, behind the scenes, diplomacy unfolded. By the late 1980s, cracks appeared in the Soviet system. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended not with nuclear war, but with the quiet lowering of a flag. The United States now stood as the world's sole superpower. The 1990s were marked by technological transformation. The internet moved from research labs into homes. Companies like Microsoft and Apple reshaped communication and commerce. A new digital economy emerged. American influence spread through culture, movies, music, brands, technology. The world consumed American products and ideas at unprecedented levels. But the illusion of invulnerability shattered on September 11, 2001. 19 terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes. 2 struck the World Trade Center towers in New York City. 1 hit the Pentagon. Another crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers resisted. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. For many Americans, the day felt like a rupture in history, a loss of innocence. The sense of safety provided by oceans vanished. The war on terror began. U.S. forces entered Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, citing weapons of mass destruction and security concerns. The conflicts lasted years, longer than many expected. They reshaped foreign policy, cost trillions of dollars, and deeply affected military families across the nation. At home, security measures expanded. The Patriot Act increased surveillance powers. Debates about liberty versus safety intensified. Then came another shock: economic collapse. In 2008, the housing market crashed. Major financial institutions teetered on the brink. The Great Recession led to massive job losses. Retirement savings disappeared almost overnight for millions. Government bailouts stabilized the system, but public anger simmered. Trust in institutions declined further. Yet, amid crisis, another historic moment occurred. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected as the first African American president of the United States. For many, it symbolized generational change and the ongoing expansion of opportunity promised centuries earlier. The 2010s became defined by rapid technological acceleration. Smartphones transformed communication. Social media reshaped politics and culture. Information moved instantly, and so did misinformation. Political polarization deepened. Debates grew sharper. Trust between opposing sides eroded. Then in 2020, an invisible enemy brought the world to a halt. The COVID-19 pandemic shut down businesses, schools, and travel. Millions fell ill. Over 1 million Americans lost their lives. Hospitals were overwhelmed. The economy contracted at record speed. Yet scientists developed vaccines in less than a year, a medical achievement unprecedented in human history. The pandemic exposed weaknesses but also resilience. Communities organized, healthcare workers persevered, businesses adapted. At the same time, nationwide protests erupted after the death of George Floyd, reigniting conversations about racial justice and policing. Once again, America confronted its unfinished history. Through all these chapters, revolution, civil war, world wars, economic collapse, terrorism, pandemic, a pattern emerges. The United States expands, fractures, debates, and reforms. It struggles openly. Its conflicts are visible to the world, but its system, designed with checks and balances in 1787, continues to absorb shock after shock. The American story has never been about perfection. It has been about tension between liberty and order, equality and inequality, isolation and global leadership, tradition and innovation. And perhaps the most astonishing truth is this: the same Constitution written with quill pens in the 18th century still governs a nation of more than 330 million people in the 21st. Few countries in history have sustained a democratic republic at this scale for so long. From wooden muskets at Lexington to stealth aircraft and satellites, from handwritten pamphlets to artificial intelligence, from a fragile alliance of colonies to a continental superpower, the arc is staggering. But history does not end. New challenges are already shaping the next chapter: emerging technologies, global competition, climate pressures, economic inequality, shifting demographics, and questions about the very meaning of freedom in a digital age. Each generation of Americans inherits both the achievements and the unfinished work of those before them. In 1776, independence seemed impossible. In 1861, unity seemed impossible. In 1933, recovery seemed impossible. In 1941, victory seemed impossible. In 1963, equality seemed impossible. Yet the nation moved forward, imperfectly, unevenly, but forward. The United States is not just a place on a map. It is an ongoing argument, a living experiment, a story still being written by soldiers and teachers, immigrants and entrepreneurs, activists and voters, dreamers and skeptics. And perhaps what history has proven anything, it is this: the most surprising chapters often come when the future looks uncertain. The question is not whether America will change, it always has. The question is how and who will shape what comes next.
And now the story moves into territory no previous generation has ever faced. A world where power is measured not only in land, armies, or factories, but in data, algorithms, and influence. In the early decades of the 21st century, America found itself in a new kind of competition, not a Cold War defined by nuclear standoffs, but a technological and economic rivalry shaping the global balance of power.
Artificial intelligence began transforming industries. Automation changed the workforce. Cybersecurity became as important as physical defense. Battles were no longer fought only on land or sea. They unfolded in invisible digital networks. Elections became intertwined with social media. Information moved at lightning speed. Truth competed with manipulation. The same platforms that connected families also amplified division. And yet, beneath the noise, the fundamental structure endured. The peaceful transfer of power, a principle established when George Washington voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms, remained one of the most powerful traditions in American governance. Even when elections were contested, courts functioned, ballots were counted, institutions held. The American system was designed not for harmony, but for friction. The founders expected disagreement. They assumed factions would rise. That is why they divided power between states and the federal government, between Congress and the president, between the branches of government themselves. The system was never meant to be fast. It was meant to be durable. Meanwhile, demographic shifts reshaped the nation. America became more diverse than ever before. Immigration continued to fuel innovation. New generations challenged old norms. Cultural conversations intensified about identity, opportunity, justice, economic fairness. Some saw progress, others saw instability, but such debates were not new. Similar tensions erupted in the 1790s, the 1850s, the 1930s, the 1960s. The difference now was scale and speed. Globalization intertwined economies. A crisis in one region rippled across continents instantly. Supply chains stretched worldwide. Energy markets fluctuated unpredictably. Climate change introduced environmental pressures, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, forcing cities and states to adapt. The American military remained one of the most advanced forces in history, but warfare itself evolved. Drones replaced battalions. Satellites became strategic assets. Cyber attacks threatened infrastructure. And in 2021, as U.S. troops withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years, the country confronted a sobering reality. Even the strongest nation cannot fully control complex foreign conflicts. The war that began after 9/11 had finally closed its longest chapter. At home, infrastructure investments aim to rebuild roads, bridges, broadband networks, modernizing the skeleton of a nation built centuries earlier. Energy transformed too. Once dependent heavily on foreign oil, the United States became one of the world's leading energy producers, while also investing in renewables like wind and solar power. The economy adapted repeatedly, from agriculture to industry, from industry to services, from services to digital technology. American companies pioneered advances in biotech, electric vehicles, space exploration, and AI. Private spaceflight, once unimaginable, became reality. Rockets launched not only under NASA's flag, but also by private firms. Mars missions were no longer science fiction. The frontier spirit that once pushed pioneers westward now looked toward orbit. Yet, despite innovation, many Americans asked fundamental questions. What is the American dream now? Is it still home ownership? Is it entrepreneurship? Is it equality of opportunity? Is it freedom from government control or protection through it? These debates are not signs of collapse. They are signs of participation. From the beginning, America has argued with itself.
Federalists versus anti-federalists. Abolitionists versus slaveholders. Isolationists versus interventionists. Industrial labor versus corporate power. Conflict is woven into its fabric. The extraordinary part is not that conflict exists, but that the framework survives it. The Constitution has been amended 27 times.
Each amendment represents adaptation, abolishing slavery, granting women the right to vote, lowering the voting age to 18. Change has come not through overthrow, but through process. And that may be the most astonishing fact of all. In many nations, political crises have led to coups, revolutions, or authoritarian rule. In the United States, crises have typically led to elections, court rulings, legislative battles, and public protest. Messy, loud, sometimes chaotic, but within a constitutional order. Even when trust in government dips, participation remains high. Americans volunteer, donate, start businesses, serve in the military, build communities, and create art and innovation that shape the world. The country has absorbed waves of immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Germany, China, Mexico, India, Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Each wave faced suspicion. Each eventually reshaped the culture. American identity has never been tied to a single ethnicity. It has been tied to an idea that individuals possess rights and government derives power from the consent of the governed. That idea, born in 1776, remains radical in many parts of the world. And yet, the American story is not only triumph. It includes injustice against Native Americans, the brutality of slavery, segregation, internment camps during World War II, discrimination against immigrants, economic inequality, political corruption. To tell the story honestly is to acknowledge both light and shadow. What makes it compelling for millions, especially Americans, is that the nation's ideals often become tools to correct its failures. Activists cite the Declaration of Independence. Lawyers invoke constitutional rights. Citizens vote leaders out of office. Courts overturn unjust laws. The founding documents act like a mirror, reflecting not what the nation is, but what it claims to be. And every generation must decide whether to move closer to that reflection or drift away from it. Today, the United States remains one of the largest economies in the world. Its universities attract global talent. Its culture influences music, film, fashion, technology. But it also faces debt, polarization, global competition, and social tension. The future is uncertain, yet uncertainty has always been part of the story. In 1781, few believed a fragile alliance of colonies could survive. In 1864, during the Civil War, many believed the Union would collapse. In 1932, millions doubted democracy could withstand economic despair. In 1968, amid assassinations and riots, the nation felt fractured beyond repair. Each time, the system bent, but did not break. Perhaps the true power of the United States has never been perfection or dominance. Perhaps it is adaptability, a written constitution that allows amendment, a federal structure that balances local and national power, a culture that encourages reinvention, and economy that rewards risk. The American story is not a straight climb upward. It is a series of tests. Some tests are passed quickly, others take generations, but the experiment continues. And here is the most important truth. The United States is not defined only by presidents, wars, or policies. It is defined by its people, by the soldier at Valley Forge who refused to quit, by the formerly enslaved man who learned to read despite prohibition, by the immigrant who opened a small shop and built a family legacy, by the factory worker who assembled aircraft during wartime, by the protester who marched across a bridge demanding voting rights, by the scientist who worked late nights to develop life-saving vaccines. History books often focus on leaders, but America has always been shaped by ordinary individuals making extraordinary choices. And that means the next chapter is not already written. It will be shaped by voters, innovators, teachers, parents, entrepreneurs, activists, by millions of daily decisions that collectively steer a nation. 250 years ago, independence seemed like a gamble. Today, the gamble continues, not against an empire overseas, but against division, complacency, and fear. The American experiment is still underway. And perhaps that is the most astonishing part of all. Not that it began in revolution, not that it survived civil war, not that it became a superpower, but that after centuries of triumph and turmoil, the question remains open. And if you step back far enough, you begin to see something even more remarkable. The United States has existed for less than 250 years. In the timeline of civilizations, that is a blink. Ancient Rome lasted centuries. Dynasties in China ruled for millennia. European monarchies trace their roots deep into the Middle Ages. And yet, in just a fraction of that time, America transformed from a fragile rebellion on the Atlantic coast into a continental nation, then into an industrial titan, and finally into a technological and military superpower whose influence touches nearly every corner of the planet. That pace of change is historically astonishing. In 1776, most Americans lived on farms. Travel was by horse or wooden ship. News moved at the speed of paper. By 1869, a railroad connected the Atlantic and Pacific. By 1903, powered flight became reality at Kitty Hawk. By 1945, the nation possessed atomic power. By 1969, it placed a human on the moon. By the 1990s, it connected the globe through the internet. And today, American-designed microchips, software, aircraft, medical research, and entertainment circulate worldwide within seconds. Few societies have compressed so much transformation into so little time. But speed creates pressure. Rapid growth has always forced America to redefine itself. The frontier closed in the 1890s. Industrialization disrupted rural life. Urbanization reshaped communities. Technology now disrupts entire industries in a decade. Every era forces a reckoning. Who benefits from progress? Who is left behind? What is the responsibility of government? What is the role of individual freedom? These questions are not new. They echo debates from the Constitutional Convention to the New Deal to the modern digital age. One of the most defining traits of the American system is decentralization. States hold enormous power. California can look politically and culturally different from Texas. New York operates differently from Florida. Local governance allows experimentation. Policies tested in one state sometimes spread to others. This federal structure has acted like a pressure valve. When tensions rise nationally, states adapt locally. At the same time, America's military alliances, NATO, partnerships in Asia, defense agreements worldwide, tie it to global stability in ways unimaginable to the founders. The oceans that once insulated the country no longer provide isolation in a world of missiles and cyber warfare. Global leadership brings both influence and responsibility. And while geopolitics evolves, everyday American life continues in quieter ways. Students graduating, families moving to new cities, small businesses opening, innovators launching startups in garages, just as previous generations did. Silicon Valley itself began as orchards before becoming a technology hub. Detroit rose with automobiles. Pittsburgh transformed from steel to medicine and robotics. Reinvention is part of the pattern. Even culturally, America exports stories. Hollywood films, hip-hop music, fast food brands, streaming platforms, and sports leagues, shaping global perceptions of freedom, wealth, and lifestyle. Yet inside the country, citizens continue wrestling with unresolved contradictions. How to balance free speech with misinformation, how to maintain economic growth while addressing inequality, how to ensure security without sacrificing liberty, how to preserve democratic norms in an age of constant outrage. These are not signs of a nation ending.
They are signs of a nation still negotiating its identity. The United States has survived precisely because it allows negotiation rather than suppressing it. In authoritarian systems, disagreement is silenced. In America, disagreement is amplified, sometimes chaotically, but openly. And openness, though messy, creates resilience. Consider this. No foreign army has successfully occupied the United States mainland. No king has ruled it. No military junta has seized permanent control. Power changes hands through ballots, not bullets. That alone places it in rare historical company. But perhaps the most extraordinary feature of the American story is psychological. From its beginning, it was built on belief. Belief that ordinary citizens could govern themselves. Belief that rights were inherent, not granted by rulers. Belief that opportunity could expand rather than remain fixed. Those beliefs have been tested repeatedly by slavery, by economic collapse, by war, by terrorism, by pandemic, yet the underlying framework still stands. As the 21st century unfolds, new forces will shape the next era. Artificial intelligence may redefine labor. Biotechnology may extend human lifespan. Space exploration may commercialize orbit. Energy transitions may alter global economics. Climate adaptation may redesign cities. And America will respond the way it always has, through debate, experimentation, success, failure, correction, and persistence. Some predict decline. Others predict continued dominance. History suggests something more nuanced: transformation. Because the United States has never remained static long enough to simply decline in a straight line. It reinvents.
The agrarian republic became an industrial power. The industrial power became a service economy. The service economy became a digital giant. The next evolution is already forming. And here's the truth that surprises many observers around the world. The strength of the United States has never been unity of opinion. It has been unity of process. Citizens disagree fiercely, but they operate within a shared constitutional structure. That structure is not flawless. It is constantly criticized, amended, interpreted, but it has outlasted every generation that doubted it. From muskets to microchips, from parchment to satellites, from rebellion to republic to superpower. The arc is not smooth. It bends, fractures, and repairs itself. And that is why the American story remains so compelling to its own people and to the world. It is not a finished monument carved in stone. It is an argument carried across centuries, an experiment still running, a promise still being tested. 2.5 centuries ago, a radical idea was written down that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. Everything since, every war, every election, every protest, every innovation has been a footnote to that idea. The next chapter will not be written in history books alone. It will be written in classrooms, in laboratories, in voting booths, in courtrooms, in small towns and major cities. And someday, future generations will look back at this era with all its turbulence and uncertainty and decide whether it was a moment of fracture or a moment of reinvention. The American story is still unfolding, and astonishingly, against all historical odds, the experiment continues. The agrarian republic became an industrial power. The industrial power became a service economy. The service economy became a digital giant. The next evolution is already forming. And here's the truth that surprises many observers around the world. The strength of the United States has never been unity of opinion. It has been unity of process. Citizens disagree fiercely, but they operate within a shared constitutional structure. That structure is not flawless. It is constantly criticized, amended, interpreted, but it has outlasted every generation that doubted it. from muskets to microchips, from parchment to satellites, from rebellion to republic to superpower. The arc is not smooth. It bends, fractures, and repairs itself. And that is why the American story remains so compelling to its own people and to the world. It is not a finished monument carved in stone. It is an argument carried across centuries, an experiment still running, a promise still being tested. 2.5 centuries ago, a radical idea was written down that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. Everything since, every war, every election, every protest, every innovation has been a footnote to that idea. The next chapter will not be written in history books alone. It will be written in classrooms, in laboratories, in voting booths, in courtrooms, in small towns and major cities. And someday, future generations will look back at this era with all its turbulence and uncertainty and decide whether it was a moment of fracture or a moment of reinvention. The American story is still unfolding, and, astonishingly, against all historical odds, the experiment continues.
And as the experiment continues, something even deeper becomes clear. America has never moved forward in a straight, confident march. It moves in cycles of doubt and renewal. Every generation believes it is living through the most divided moment in history. In the 1790s, political opponents accused each other of betraying the revolution. Newspapers were vicious. Friendships collapsed over ideology. In the 1850s, members of Congress physically fought on the Senate floor over slavery. In the 1930s, some Americans believed democracy itself would fail under economic collapse. In the 1960s, cities burned, leaders were assassinated, and protests filled the streets. And yet, the constitutional system absorbed the pressure each time. The pattern is striking. Crisis, division, debate, reform, adjustment, repeat. That rhythm has defined the American journey. But there is another layer to the story: geography. The United States is vast. Forests, deserts, mountains, plains, oceans, from Alaska's frozen frontiers to Florida's subtropical coastlines, from the skyscrapers of Manhattan to the ranch lands of Wyoming. This physical size shaped the national character. Expansion westward in the 19th century created a culture of mobility. Americans moved constantly, chasing land, gold, railroads, oil, opportunity. Movement became normal. Even today, Americans relocate for work more frequently than many societies. Reinvention is almost expected. If a town declines, people leave. If an industry fades, new ones emerge elsewhere. That fluidity fuels both dynamism and instability. Industries rise and fall quickly. Communities boom and bust. But the broader system keeps adapting. The country's immigration story adds another dimension. Unlike nations built around a single ethnic lineage, the United States formed around civic identity, shared principles rather than shared ancestry. Wave after wave arrived. Irish fleeing famine, Italians escaping poverty, Jews escaping persecution, Chinese laborers building railroads, Mexican workers supporting agriculture, Indian and Asian engineers driving technology. Each wave faced resistance at first. Each wave eventually reshaped the culture. Food changed, music changed, language absorbed new rhythms, the national identity stretched. The idea of America became larger than its origins. But the 21st century introduces a new test, not of territory or industry, but of attention. Never before have citizens been exposed to so much information so instantly. News breaks in seconds. Opinions multiply by the millions. Algorithms amplify outrage. Narratives compete nonstop. In this environment, trust becomes fragile. Trust in media, trust in elections, trust in institutions, trust in each other. And yet, even amid skepticism, Americans continue participating,
voting in record numbers, debating policies, forming grassroots movements. Participation itself is a sign of belief. If citizens truly thought the system was meaningless, they would disengage entirely. Instead, they argue fiercely because they believe outcomes matter. Meanwhile, global challenges intensify.
Rising powers test economic dominance. Supply chains shift. Energy strategies evolve. Climate patterns force adaptation in agriculture, infrastructure, and insurance markets. But here is what history suggests. The United States often innovates most rapidly under pressure. The Civil War accelerated industrialization. World War II accelerated scientific breakthroughs. The Cold War accelerated space and computing technology. The pandemic accelerated vaccine development and remote work systems. Pressure produces response, and response produces transformation. There is also a generational factor. Younger Americans today inherit a country more diverse, more technologically advanced, and more globally connected than any generation before them. They question assumptions, they challenge traditions, they demand transparency. Older generations, having lived through different struggles, emphasize stability, experience, and caution. This generational tension is not unique to America, but within a democracy, it becomes visible and powerful. The ballot box becomes the battlefield of ideas. And perhaps that is the key distinction in the American narrative. Conflict does not automatically mean collapse. It often signals transition. Look back at 1864. The Civil War was still raging. Casualties were staggering. President Lincoln was deeply unpopular. Many believed he would lose re-election. Yet the election happened in the middle of war. That act alone sent a message to the world. Even in existential crisis, democratic process continued. That resilience is part of the national DNA. But resilience is not guaranteed. It requires civic literacy. It requires engagement. It requires compromise. It requires faith in process, even when outcomes disappoint. The American experiment depends not on perfection, but on participation. And as technology reshapes reality, artificial intelligence writing code, self-driving cars navigating cities, biotech altering medicine, new ethical questions arise. What is privacy? What is work? What defines free speech in digital spaces? How does a republic govern platforms that operate globally? The Constitution did not foresee social media. It did not anticipate quantum computing, but it did anticipate change. Its principles, separation of powers, federalism, amendment, judicial review, were designed to endure beyond the imagination of their authors. That adaptability may be the most astonishing achievement of all, because history is filled with nations that rose quickly and fell just as quickly. The United States has risen, fractured, corrected, and continued, not because it avoids mistakes, but because it confronts them in public. The American story is not about being the oldest nation, it is about being one of the most continuously self-correcting at scale. And that scale matters. Over 330 million people, 50 states, hundreds of languages spoken at home, the largest economy in nominal GDP, one of the most influential militaries and cultural exporters in history. Managing that complexity peacefully is historically rare. The next chapter may include economic shifts toward green energy. It may include deeper AI integration into daily life. It may include new alliances or strategic rivalries. It may include constitutional debates over digital rights. But if past centuries offer guidance, the trajectory will not be linear. There will be setbacks. There will be overreactions. There will be reforms. And then adjustment. From the musket smoke of Lexington to the glow of smartphone screens, from handwritten declarations to encrypted communications, from horse-drawn carriages to reusable rockets, the through line remains astonishingly consistent. A belief, sometimes strained, sometimes questioned, that people can govern themselves. That belief is fragile, but it has survived revolution, civil war, depression, global conflict, social upheaval, and terrorism. And so the American story continues, not as a finished epic, but as a living narrative. The founders could not have imagined skyscrapers piercing clouds, satellites mapping Earth, or conversations like this traveling instantly across the globe. But they did imagine something enduring, a republic strong enough to argue with itself and survive. The next test will come. History guarantees that. The question, as always, will not be whether disagreement exists. The question will be whether the process holds. If it does, the experiment continues. And that may remain the most extraordinary historical reality of all. And if history has taught Americans anything, it is this. The test always comes when confidence is highest or when it is lowest. Nations rarely collapse from a single blow. They erode when belief fades. The American story has repeatedly hovered at that edge and stepped back. What makes the United States unusual in the long arc of history is not simply its power. It is the tension between idealism and realism that constantly reshapes it. From the beginning, the nation lived with contradiction. A declaration that all men are created equal coexisted with slavery. A constitution defending liberty initially excluded women and Native Americans. Expansion promised opportunity while displacing entire populations. These contradictions were not footnotes, they were central conflicts. And instead of being buried, they became battlegrounds. Abolitionists forced the slavery issue into the national conscience. Suffragists demanded voting rights for women. Civil rights activists demanded equal protection under the law. Each movement used America's own founding language as leverage. That pattern reveals something extraordinary. The nation's founding documents act not only as law, but as moral ammunition. Citizens invoke them when the country falls short. Few societies have embedded self-criticism so deeply into their structure. But self-criticism can feel destabilizing, especially in a digital age where flaws are magnified instantly and globally. In earlier centuries, crises unfolded slowly. Today, markets fluctuate by the minute, news cycles refresh by the second. A local event can become a national controversy within hours. The psychological strain of constant urgency is new. Yet, even in this accelerated era, some fundamentals remain steady. Courts hear challenges, states manage elections, Congress debates budgets, journalists investigate, citizens organize. The machinery of governance continues turning, often slower than public emotion demands. Slowness, as frustrating as it can be, is sometimes a feature, not a flaw. The system was built to prevent rapid swings of power from permanently reshaping the nation overnight. Checks and balances were designed for friction, and friction generates heat, but also stability. Consider the economic arc. In 1900, the U.S. economy was driven largely by manufacturing and raw materials. By mid-century, it dominated global industrial output. By the late 20th century, services and finance rose. In the 21st century, intellectual property, software, and data have become central assets. Each shift displaced workers. Each shift sparked anxiety. Each shift demanded retraining and adaptation. And yet the overall system adjusted, imperfectly, unevenly, but forward. That pattern may repeat again as automation and artificial intelligence redefine productivity. Some jobs will disappear, others will emerge. The national conversation will intensify around education, universal access, income distribution, and opportunity. But transformation has always been part of the American rhythm. There is also the matter of leadership. Presidents come and go. Some are revered, some are controversial, some are later reevaluated by historians. But no single presidency defines the entire arc. Washington set the precedent of voluntary power transfer. Lincoln preserved the Union. Franklin Roosevelt redefined federal responsibility during crisis. Truman made decisions that reshaped global geopolitics. Reagan navigated the final stage of the Cold War.
Others managed quieter transitions or faced turbulent moments. Leadership matters, but institutions outlast individuals. That continuity may be one of the most stabilizing forces in American history. Meanwhile, the military remains under civilian control, another rare historical trait. Generals do not seize power. Elections determine command authority. Globally, this civilian tradition distinguishes the United States from many powers that rose and fell through coups or military rule. And yet, despite institutional durability, public trust fluctuates. Trust rises after national unity events like World War II or the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Trust declines after prolonged conflict, scandal, or economic hardship. The cycle continues. But perhaps the most powerful constant in the American story is aspiration, the belief that tomorrow can be better than today. That belief fueled pioneers crossing mountains. It fueled inventors filing patents. It fueled entrepreneurs building companies from garages. It fueled activists marching for rights not yet granted. Hope has been both a political force and an economic engine. Critics argue that optimism can blind citizens to systemic problems. Supporters argue that optimism drives correction and innovation. Both can be true. And that tension is uniquely American, the ability to criticize fiercely while still believing in potential. As the 21st century unfolds further, the United States faces overlapping pressures: strategic competition with rising global powers, economic inequality within its own borders, a rapidly aging infrastructure in need of modernization, climate-related disasters increasing in frequency, cultural divisions amplified by digital ecosystems. None of these challenges are small, but history suggests that large-scale adaptation often begins slowly in policy committees, university labs, state legislatures, private boardrooms, grassroots organizations. Major shifts rarely appear dramatic at first, they accumulate. The American story is less like a single dramatic arc and more like tectonic plates: slow pressure, occasional rupture, long-term reshaping. From the outside, the country can appear chaotic. From the inside, that chaos often masks structured competition within rules. The founders did not design harmony. They designed contest within boundaries. And perhaps that is why the Republic persists, because it assumes disagreement, it anticipates ambition, it distributes authority to prevent concentration, it creates pathways for amendment rather than revolt. This does not eliminate conflict, but it channels it. And channeling conflict is often the difference between transformation and collapse. 250 years after independence, the United States remains a paradox: powerful yet self-critical, divided yet institutionally stable, influential globally yet deeply focused on internal debates, young compared to ancient civilizations yet old compared to most modern republics. The next chapters will likely include breakthroughs that today seem unimaginable. Just as the founders could not envision jet aircraft or the internet, modern citizens cannot fully predict the technological or geopolitical landscape 50 years from now. But if the underlying pattern holds, one thing is likely: the country will argue about it, intensely, publicly, relentlessly. And through that argument, it will adjust. The American experiment was never about guaranteeing outcomes. It was about preserving the process that allows outcomes to evolve. That process, flawed, noisy, imperfect, has carried the nation across centuries of upheaval. And so, as the narrative stretches forward into uncertain decades, one truth stands out. The United States is not merely a historical achievement. It is an ongoing negotiation between ideals and reality. And negotiations, unlike monuments, are alive. The story continues, not because it is easy, but because millions of people continue choosing to participate in it. That choice, repeated generation after generation, may be the most remarkable chapter of all.